All right. So tonight we're going to continue talking about the theology of the body topic that we were looking at last time. So theology of the body is this set of teachings that, it's a formulation that was given to us by Pope John Paul II in response to some of the errors of a proper understanding of who we are as men and women, especially with regard to the sexual revolution. But these are not necessarily new teachings in the church with Pope John Paul II, but he builds upon the moral teachings of the church through the centuries in order to clarify them, especially in the context of the confusion that we have in our world today. So we kind of looked at theology of the body in general. We looked at some principles. I built it out off of kind of the scriptural portion, going back to God's plan for who we are as men and women from the very beginning. We looked at how our love expressed properly is to will the good of the other, choosing to do the good. So love is much more than just a feeling. There is a decision, a choice to it. That's why, for example, when you get married, you can make vows, right? You can't vow to always feel good, but you can vow to choose the good of the other person. We looked at love being modeled after the very love of God, that his love is free, total, faithful, and fruitful. And so when we're going through and evaluating different moral teachings in the area of sexual ethics, we can apply those categories. Is this action expressing free, total, faithful, fruitful love or not? And if it's missing any of those characteristics, then it's not full, authentic expression of what the use of our sexuality is meant to have. So we also talked about the concept of the language of the body as well, that our bodies speak a language that God has built into us objectively. He's the one who's created our bodies, and so he's the one who determines the language that is expressed through it. So those are some of the background concepts, and then we began to talk about specific moral cases. Let's see, we talked about contraception. We talked a bit about, before that we talked about, we applied adultery, we apply, having relations prior to marriage. So we began to apply it to a first few. We're going to continue to do that today. But I got so caught up in giving you a review of what we talked about last time, I forgot to stop and pray. So we better do that. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we ask you to help guide our minds and our hearts to be able to be open to hearing your words. You challenge us to model our love after your love, and sometimes it can seem like it's too much, but we know that with your grace, your help, we can live it out, that your plan from the very beginning has not been thrown away. But with your grace, we can live out these beautiful teachings of the fullness of the faith. Please help our hearts to be open to receive this. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, one of the things, just to kind of bring us in as the specific topics, I brought up this quote from the Venerable Dr. Jérôme Lejeune. Mentioned him last time as being this French geneticist who just helped discover the extra chromosome that is the cause of Down syndrome. He worked very closely with Down syndrome children. There's beautiful, wonderful pictures that you can find of him, working with Down syndrome children. So he was very concerned that his research was going to be used to try to eliminate Down syndrome children before they're born, i.e. through abortion. He spoke against it and ended up, he never got a Nobel Prize for his work, even though his colleagues said that he should. But once he gave a speech on against abortion, he knew he had lost it, that they weren't going to give it to him after that. But this is something that he said, and it's a good kind of summary as to how a lot of these issues are related to one another. So we looked at contraception last time. Contraception is to make love without a child, right? So one engages in the act of giving of intimacy with one another, but it's with the intent of not being open to the possibility of life. And see, there's a difference between, there's a difference between contraception and, say, like a couple who are unable to have children, right? It's in order for the marital act to express free, total, faithful, and fruitful love doesn't mean that every action will result in a child, right? Because obviously God made us a certain way. There is a cycle of fertility, so not every act is going to lead to a child. But there must be an openness on the part of the couple, and contraception expresses a complete opposite, the intention to remove that lack of openness, right? So artificial fertilization, which we're going to come up, we'll probably get to that one tonight as well, is to make a child without making love. So you're trying to bring another human being into the world, but you're doing it using means that separate the creation of that child from the loving act between the parents of the child. Abortion is to just completely unmake the child, right? We kill the child before it is able to leave its mother. And pornography says is to unmake love, right? Love, which is meant to be I give myself for your good. Pornography will find, well, by its very nature, there's not an other there. It's a self-turning in. So it is the opposite of love. It can't be love because you don't have more than one person there. So anyway, I also kind of gave you kind of a rundown of how once parts of God's plan from the very beginning begins to erode, it leads to the next and the next and the next kind of erosion of that. So, right? So going all the way back to divorce, no-fault divorce removed the permanence from the unitive aspect of marriage. Contraception removes the procreation from the act between husband and wife within marriage. And so we're going to build on that, and we're going to begin by looking at abortion, because abortion really is intimately connected with contraception. Abortion really becomes backup contraception. And so when there is a contraceptive mentality, a mentality that is, against life, abortion is going to come as part of that as well. And we'll see that's actually not even, it's not necessarily just the church saying that these two are connected. It is our justice system in the United States that's said that it's connected. So this is from 1992, a Supreme Court case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And in it, this was a case that ensured that abortion would remain legal. And it says that for 2 decades of economic and social developments, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail. So it's explicitly saying there is that abortion must remain legal because people use it as a contraceptive method, right, when contraception fails, right? So we would agree and say, yes, of course, that would be one of the reasons why we're still against it. But we know that, unfortunately, culturally, yes, that's a way that has been done. So the contraceptive mentality has led to this greater reliance on abortion. So, as Catholics, to be completely consistent, that's why the church is against both, right? Because there are, we saw that there's other Christian denominations that, previously would have been against contraception, but have allowed it in their moral systems. But there's an inconsistency between there. They might be against abortion, but okay with contraception. But the problem is that they go together in the way that it forms people. So what is the church teaching with regard to abortion? Most people know this, so we'll probably go rather quickly through the abortion section here because I think a lot of people are aware of what the church teaches with regard to abortion. So as the Catechism says, this goes way back in the church's teaching since the 1st century. She has affirmed the moral evil of every procured abortion. This hasn't changed. It remains unchangeable. The church is not going to change it. Direct abortion that is willed either as an end or as a means is gravely contrary to the moral law because an innocent life is being taken, it's being killed. It's an attack on an unborn human being. So it is so morally reprehensible that there is even an ecclesiastical penalty that is included upon that sin. So it already is a moral sin. It's a mortal sin. It can cut us off from the light of God. But the church, to certain very grave sins, will place a kind of church penalty, meaning that to receive absolution sacramentally through it for this sin, that penalty also needs to be removed. So an automatic excommunication, that's when, if you hear the term excommunication, that's basically what it means. It's a church penalty. It's not a permanent thing, but it points out that this is a serious matter and that you need to seek forgiveness. So whenever the Catholic Church says this one action had an excommunication attached to it, it's not saying the person can't be forgiven. What it's doing is it's pointing out what you've done is very severe and you need to seek forgiveness, right? So for anybody who obtains an abortion or for those who cooperate in helping another person obtain an abortion, automatic excommunication occurs on the person. But this isn't to restrict mercy of the church. Just point out how grave this is. So this excommunication, most people probably don't even know that it's a part of it because it's automatic, right? We don't have to declare it publicly. It's an automatic thing. But if someone comes to seek forgiveness and they come for reconciliation, they come for confession, and they confess that sin, I, as a priest, any priest in the Archdiocese of Omaha has the ability to remove that excommunication through that sacrament, right? And in fact, we don't have to say anything. So if anybody would come, and they're truly sorry for it, I'm not going to mention anything about this, right? I'm only mentioning it now because it points out just the severity of abortion. In fact, after the Year of Mercy, every single priest has this ability everywhere. It was at first only in certain countries where abortion was, unfortunately, more prevalent. But unfortunately, since it's become more prevalent throughout the world, across the globe, that's why the church has said, the regular priest is able to forgive the sin without having to do any. There are other excommunicationable type offenses that do have to go to higher ups, but those are usually very few and far between. You have to do things like, physically attack the Pope or something, So most of the people in our parishes are not going to be confessing that. We may not have the opportunity. No. There are different kinds of abortions. I'm not going to go into all the details here about the different types of abortion, but it is important to know that different methods are used depending upon often the age of the child as the unborn. And so if you are interested, there's a good site, abortionprocedures.com, that goes through and it shows you what the procedures are. And it does using, computer graphics so that you're not going to see the actual, abortion itself. But it is good for us to know what kind of things happen. Like, for example, this one, the aspiration abortion, is when they use a suction tube. And they would go in and basically suction the child out. Obviously, it has to be earlier in its development in order for them to use that. Later on, they're going to use other methods, including like the D&E one. They're going to go in and basically tear the child apart from within the mother. So it's very, and then like the DNX abortions, sometimes called partial birth abortions, is when the child is too fully developed for them to do earlier forms of abortion, and they'll basically, it's called partial birth because they basically nearly birth the child except for the child's head, and then they go in and they end its life just before it could be actually born and live. So all these kinds of abortions happen in different numbers. Earlier kinds of abortions are going to medical abortions. These would be using chemical pills with chemicals that basically end the life of the child through the use of poisoning it to death. There's more of those happening earlier on than some of these later ones. But any abortion is horrific because it's ending the life of a human being.
And don't they call that, I think it's Plan B?
Oh, yeah, the abortifacients?
Well, the second one, medical abortion, the pills that they give, you can actually get them at Walgreens and CVS.
Yeah.
So, I think it's methotrexate, but I'm not.
The ones, let's see, the ones I have here, mifepristone
That's what it is.
and misoprostol
Yeah.
are the, you don't need to remember the chemicals specifically,
They
but.
used to call Plan B early on when that first came out.
So you might wonder, well, certainly not all of these are allowed. Well, here's what the law was. We'll see that this is no longer the law, thankfully, anymore. But starting in 1979 was the Supreme Court case Roe versus Wade that basically stated that it took the right of states to decide what to do about abortion away from them, and basically said that you can regulate safety. You cannot outlaw it in the first 2 trimesters, and you can do some regulation in the second trimester, and you can ban in the 3rd trimester. But everything so if some states didn't want to ban it in the 3rd trimester, then 3rd trimester abortions were perfectly fine, in those states. So, but along with Dole versus Bolton, which came out at the same time, this one defined what health was. So abortions, so if you can ban 3rd trimester if you allow the exception of health for the mother. And health of the mother means any physical, emotional, psychological, familial, or anything related to the woman's age. In other words, it was such a broad definition that literally anything falls under it. So in other words, these two together effectively made abortion legal during all 9 months of pregnancy, apart from certain states making some restrictions, but still they always had to give that allowance for the exceptions. So basically, you could still get an abortion for any reason because you could claim health for it. So regardless of whether it was an actual health thing, even if the reason was I simply don't want a child, we'll see here in a second that the reasons for contraception were often social reasons, and the same thing for abortion. They're often social reasons, not medical reasons. This, though, was finally overturned. Almost took 50 years, but this was overturned June 24th of 2022, Supreme Court decision Dobbs versus Jackson, overturned Roe versus Wade, determined that the Constitution doesn't give a right for abortion in it. It was never written to include that, but it did not eliminate abortion. Plenty of people tried to claim that that's what happened, is that it now outlawed abortion in the United States. No. Not at all. It returned the question back to the states. So now the state laws are where each state determines what's going to be legal or not. So Nebraska, our state, has a number of abortion restrictions. Right? These are the ones, some of I don't have, this was at least in 2022. So there's a bunch of restrictions. But all these restrictions, remember, were still under the Roe versus Wade. You can't do anything in the first first trimester, a little bit in the second, and you could ban it outright in the 3rd as long as for health. So, but very quickly after this was overturned, then we had legislation here in Nebraska. You may recall the initiatives. We talked a lot about it at the parishes here. We had 2 different initiatives on the ballot in 2024. We had the pro-life one, 434, which we encouraged people to vote for that one. And then we had the very extreme pro-abortion one, 439, that we encouraged everyone to vote against. And in that time, there were people that were concerned that the pro-life one wasn't pro-life enough, because basically what 434 does is it basically ensures that all this stays in place, that all these restrictions stay there, and because had that passed, all that's gone. That would all have been wiped out. Because if you look, it's like all persons have a fundamental right to abortion until fetal viability. But what in the legislation that's defined, once again, so broadly that it basically allows for any case. So what 434 does is it says, except when a woman seeks an abortion necessitated by a medical emergency or when pregnancy results from sexual assault or incest, unborn children shall be protected from abortion in the second and third trimester. Now, it may sound at first like, oh, are we supporting abortions? It's not actually doing that. What it's doing is it's protecting all the circumstances that these things apply in. And it's remaining silent on the other areas. And the reason why we needed to do that is because looking at where people are in our state, people were not yet at a place where we would be able to pass a completely pro-life legislation that completely outlawed, if we gave people an all or nothing situation, no abortions or all abortions, unfortunately there'd end up being more people that are going to vote for the all than for the none. I mean, just look at the percentages that ended up. So this is the real voting percentages for the state, right? Look how close, like on this one, we won, well, obviously they're all close, but by a lot more, but look at this one, right? That 49 to 50.99%, that's very, very close. Had this one passed and this one failed, this one would have been. But had both of them passed, but that one passed with a greater number of votes, then that one would have been law, right? So, but the 434 received 509 plus thousand votes, whereas 439 received 455,000 plus votes. So, had this been switched, reversed, this one still would have prevailed. Because there have been more overall votes for it. So that's why we did it the way that we did. And I say we, I mean like I'll talk about later, there is an organization that helps promote issues that are important to us as Catholics. It's called the Nebraska Catholic Conference. So, and I'll talk about that later, as you can find what's happening in the legislature and what kind of moral issues are going on, and as a Catholic, what should I think about this? Is there any resource that I can go to sort through all this legalese and figure out what I'm supposed to think? Nebraska Catholic Conference is a great resource. They work in close conjunction with the bishops to make sure that they're helping promote. Other organizations lobby for their interests in government, and so that's one of the things that they do, is trying to advocate for the good legislation and against the bad legislation. Here in Nebraska, just to give you a little bit of statistics, this is Nebraska abortions. The total number of abortions in the blue have gone down, but the majority of the abortions now are the drug-induced abortions, so these are the medical abortions. So these are non-surgical ones, and these are occurring in the very early on in the first trimester. But oftentimes those are ones that are, not as seen because, the child is not as developed yet at that time. So there are still abortions going on in Nebraska. Certainly not as much as other states, but still is occurring here. Here's the rate of abortions in Nebraska. So the U.S. is the orange and Nebraska's here. So we are lower. This is, the numbers are abortions per 1,000 women, ages 15 to 44. So anyway, so a little bit of background statistics. What do we do? As Catholics, we are against abortion. So what do we do against it? There's three main things that we can do. The first thing is, sometimes people will claim that, pro-life people are just pro-life about children before they're born, and they don't care about children after they're born, right? This, of course, is not an accurate assessment. Catholic Church certainly, and many Christians are very much supportive of the needs of women and their children. So we have various ways in which to help those that not only while they're pregnant, but then also assist them afterwards. And recently in our parishes, encourage people to, we have a committee that works with walking with moms in need. So they have resources for, how do we help? Because we find that oftentimes, women that choose abortions are choosing because they feel like they don't have another option, right? Which is the exact opposite of what like abortion facilities like Planned Parenthood will say is like, it's, you should be pro-choice. You have a choice. But the problem is they don't feel like they have a choice, and the only choice they have is abortion, right? Whereas giving them help actually gives them the ability to choose to care for their child rather than end the life of their child, right? They need that support system. So that's what some of these, it's one of the things we should do. Political action. We should be involved with things like changing laws. It took 50 years to overturn Roe versus Wade, and we have more fights on our hands in our states, because if we think that's the last time we're going to have initiatives like that where we're going to have to fight, the lobbies for abortion are not going to give up that easily. So there's the Nebraska Catholic Conference. The website for them is necatholic.org. And I'll come back to them another time too, as they've got all sorts of resources. So a very important thing that we should do is pro-life persuasion, right? How do we talk to people? Because I mentioned we couldn't put forth a fully pro-life legislation here in Nebraska because where people are at just simply aren't there. They're not going to vote for, if they're going to vote for all or nothing, they're probably going to vote for the abortions and not for none. So we need to talk to people and help begin to change hearts to help people see that. And that is going to involve personal one-on-one dialogue with people, right? How do we talk about that? But this can be very intimidating. How do I talk about things of the faith, especially if it's a controversial, cultural subject like abortion? Well, one place that we should begin, or try to help direct the content, or help direct the conversation to, is really get to the most important question. The most important question is, what are the unborn, right? And that's a good way to put it, because we're not assuming personhood or anything yet in this question. We're just asking, objectively, what is there within the woman, right? What is it? What is the unborn? Wonderful resource book. Trent Horn, he's a Catholic apologist. He has a whole book called Persuasive Pro-Life. He gives little examples of like conversations and things in there. So he's a very good apologist. He talks on all sorts of other topics too. You can find him online. He's got a podcast and all that. So because it's important to understand or address that question, what are the unborn? Because that's the pivotal point. If the unborn is not a human being, well then abortion is just another medical procedure and shouldn't matter. But if it is a human being, then we have to ask what we can or can't do to a human being. What is morally acceptable and what's not. If the unborn is not a human person, no justification is necessary. But if it is a human person, there is no justification that's going to be adequate against the person. So how do we redirect conversations to that main issue of what is the unborn? Well, one way of doing that is to use this method. The first thing you want to do is, whenever you're talking with anybody about, whether it's religion or things like that, ask them questions. What do you believe, right? That way you are listening to them and you understand exactly where they're coming from. If you can, try to build some kind of common ground, right? Things that you can agree with, agree where possible. And then we want to challenge with humility, right? Well, we agree on this thing, but what about this aspect, right? So challenge them, but do it in a way that's, loving. So one way to challenge them is through, this is from Trent Horn's, he calls it to trot out a toddler argument. And he says, so take the reason that they want to give to justify why we need abortion and apply it to a toddler. Would that same reason justify the killing of a toddler, right? And, you could even make it, imagine he's right here, right? Here's the 2-year-old, with that same reason, and then you give them a chance to respond. And hopefully their response will be no. It wouldn't justify. If they say yes, it would justify killing a toddler. You're going to have a much more difficult time getting anywhere in a conversation. Because if they believe in infanticide, then... And there are people who, in order to avoid having to say that abortion is not morally justifiable, they end up justifying other things worse. But we can ask why. Why would it be wrong to, kill a 2-year-old based upon, let's say it's poverty, right? That's can be one of the reasons, right? Well, a mother should be able to end the life of her unborn child because she doesn't have money to be able to care for the child. All right, well, what if she has a 2-year-old, but she's in poverty and she doesn't have money to care for the child? Should she be allowed to kill it? Well, no. Well, why? Why would that be wrong? And hopefully, when they give the response, then you can conclude, oh, so the reason is because that's a person. That is a human being. You don't do that to a born child, right? So there's the question. If the unborn are just like that 2-year-old, if they are also a human being, we would also have to come to the conclusion that you can't do that. So now suddenly you have to talk about, well, are they? Are they a human being? And so that argument can all sorts of different things, whether it's poverty, right to choose, age, health, overpopulation, child abuse, all these kinds of things can be redirected to, do any of those issues justify the ending the life of a toddler? I mean, if they don't, well then, what's the difference between the toddler and the unborn child, right? And so it leads the direction to what are the unborn, right? That's the main thing you're trying to do there, is direct to, okay, let's talk about what the unborn is. Once you get to that point, then we know 3 things about the unborn, right? The 3 things we know about the unborn is that they're alive, they take in nutrients and they grow through cellular reproduction. They're human. They're offspring of human parents. They have human DNA, so that's what they are. They're not something else other than human. And they're organisms. They're not just random sets of cells. They're organisms that are organized in such a way as that they can grow, right? They're very different from just like sperm and eggs or body cells, which in and of themselves are not going to grow and change into a complete organism. Whereas, so these 3 things together are things that we scientifically know about what the unborn is. But even if we come to the conclusion that the unborn are indeed human, you still have to then address the philosophical question as to, when does a human organism have intrinsic value? Right? Because maybe it could be the case that some human organisms don't have intrinsic value under certain circumstances. Right? Someone could potentially argue that. So the question is, for our point of view, based upon what we believe, how God created us, is shouldn't we treat all human organisms, or human beings is what we usually call them, shouldn't we treat them equally, regardless of whatever characteristic you want to say, whatever level of development they are, regardless of how able-bodied they are, or mentally developed, or their age, or their race, or their sex, or any other factor, shouldn't all human organisms, human beings, be treated equally and have a basic right to live, right? That is basically the pro-life position, is that we treat all human beings equally, and they should have a right to live, because they all have the same worth, regardless of whatever characteristics you can say about them. And if someone says no, if someone says, yes, there are certain conditions that a human organism can be in that means they don't have that right to life, well, then they got to give the reason. Well, what's the reason to disqualify them from that, right? What justifies their disqualification? Because the times in history where people have attempted to disqualify people, other human beings, based upon various reasons, you're not always in a good camp with those you're in the camp of things like, genocides and, slavery and, those kinds of things. So they're really, the reasons that someone might give for why an unborn would be disqualified from having the worth usually is going to fall under 4 differences between the unborn and the born. The main 4 differences is size, level of development, environment, and dependency. And so you recognize what it is that they're arguing about. You know, if they're saying, you know, well, it's just, you know, yes, it is a human organism, but this human organism is not yet fully developed. So therefore, it doesn't have yet a right to live yet, right? So that's a level of development, right? So recognize which one it is. Affirm that you're right. There's a difference there. You know, an unborn child is not developed in the same degree as the born child, right? But then you want to show that that difference has nothing to do with that, with whether or not they're a person, right? Because all of these differences can be said of between certain born persons as well. So all of these things are irrelevant to the value of that human being. So size, for example. Of course the unborn are smaller, right? Nobody's going to deny that the unborn are smaller than the born, right? But why does that matter? You know, newborn infants are also small. They're also, you know, premature infants. They're even smaller, right? Does that mean that they don't have as much worth as, you know, as a larger one, right? Well, hopefully we can obviously see, well, that doesn't make any sense. You know, that just because, you know, are shorter people worth less than taller people? Yeah. So we can see that, yes, size is not a disqualifying thing. What about level of development? Obviously, unborn can't function in the same level of development as someone who's born, right? They can't think or feel the same level. But just because they can't function, does that disqualify them? I mean, born children, right, can't function on the same level as adults. You know, teenagers can't function on the same. No. But we wouldn't say that takes away their human worth. Environment. The unborn can't survive outside the womb. We would acknowledge that, right? You know, but why is moving them from one place to another, just because they're in the womb or out of the womb, does that change their worth in any way? You know, just because you're living in Nebraska means you're worth more than if you live in Iowa. No. So here's an absurd. Let's see if it plays here. It may not play. Wasn't able to check this ahead of time. Okay, it's not going to play. Never mind. We don't need to. All right. And the last one is dependency. The unborn are more dependent upon their mother. But why would that mean that they're worth less? I mean, usually with most people, those that are more dependent and vulnerable, we care for in a greater way. Right? We do that with born children, you know. So none of these characteristics, which are usually what is going to be used to try to justify justify abortion, none of them are legitimate. And so obviously, I'm did very broad strokes, and you know, it probably takes, you know, a number of times, you know, engaging in conversations with people to get to. You're not going to be able to do it perfectly, I'm trying to say, but it can't. It's important for us to engage in these conversations. So yeah, I just had a question from Rachel, and the question disappeared, so I got to go find it. All right. Yeah. She's asking about ectopic pregnancy. So a directly willed abortion, attacking the life of the unborn child, is always going to be morally wrong. Now, there can be certain cases in which the church applies something called the principle of double effect, in which if there is a disease that is being addressed that has a secondary effect of, we foresee that this could end the life of the unborn child, though that is not willed, but we know that it can occur, then the principle of double effect can potentially be applied. this has to occur. This is going to be applied and occur in very specific cases because there are certain conditions, and we can't get into all the details about it right now. Most of the time, with regard to like very difficult types of situations where it's the concern for the life of the mother, what is going to be done is, so obviously it's not necessarily ectopic is very much earlier in the pregnancy, but if it's the case in which like there are medical complications, what the medical procedure would be to do is to attempt to deliver the child, even if we foresee the fact that the child may not be able to live, right? But actually, if you talk to doctors, abortion is almost never used for the life of the mother in those kind of circumstances because abortion takes too long, right? So abortion, the procedure itself, the process of preparing and everything, takes much longer than just simply the procedure that would attempt to deliver the child. And so that's what they're going to normally follow. But yes, with things like ectopic pregnancy, the specific circumstance, you look at it and, all right, the choice always has to be to remove the disease through the procedure, not attack the child directly. All right. So, yep, there's the pro-life position that all human beings have the equal right to live, regardless of how old or young they are, whether they live in the crib or the womb. We want to treat them equally. So, all right. Other questions?
I kind of do. You know, it's crazy how, what is the mentality between justifying taking human life, but most people have a pet. If that pet is pregnant, you won't ever hear that they're going to go in and abort them because they just can't afford that. And if somebody did, a lot of times they'll be in an uproar like, how could you do that to a dog or any animal?
Yeah.
Why is there such a disconnect where you would do anything to save your pet and they're on board versus the human? What?
Yeah, it's part of that distortion of the whole kind of culture that is against life, that's not open to life, is, sin distorts us, like the piece of paper analogy, right, that I used, right? It doesn't destroy who we are, but it distorts our thinking, distorts the way we look at things, so suddenly we now see animals as having greater worth than human beings.
Is a child a threat?
So I would say, for a woman that's considering abortion, oftentimes, and when they ask and try to figure out more information, is that oftentimes they know that is their child, but they're faced with a choice of two deaths. The death of their child, which they know is a child, but they at this point cannot see or visualize, right? Versus their own death. Okay, because it's not, literally it doesn't mean their own actual physical death, but it means the death of the life that they had anticipated for themselves, right? And so they're faced with two deaths. And so they feel like their only choice is the death of the one that I cannot see, versus the death of the life that I have built out in front of me in my mind, as to what I will have. So that's why part of that pregnancy help is to help them realize it doesn't necessarily mean the death of the life that you anticipated. Yes, there will be some changes, but having a child doesn't mean you can't have other things. That it can be an enriching of your life. So, we'll continue. So the next one we're going to talk about, so we've talked about contraception so far, we talked about abortion. Next we're going to talk about pornography. Let's apply free, total, faithful, fruitful as we start off here. What do you think? Pornography, free, total, faithful, fruitful. Any of those missing in the use of pornography?
All of them.
Yeah, so free, is it free? You might say, well, someone freely chose to do it. But what happens with pornography is that it can trap someone in the habit. And suddenly they find their freedom losing their freedom because they feel like they have to follow the impulses. Total. There's not another person to give yourself totally to, right? So there's not a total gift of oneself to the other, nor is there anything being received. Faithful. No, in fact, if a person using it is in a relationship, it can be seen as a kind of unfaithfulness. Fruitful. No, there's really no life that comes. It's not life-giving. Pornography use. These are some older statistics. I don't have the most current statistics. So it's fairly bleak. But more and more people, fortunately, even outside of areas of faith, are recognizing that this is an issue and a problem with use of pornography. So adding up statistics, this was in 2015. I read this statistic. If you added up the stats from just one pornography website, human beings have spent 1 million years watching pornography, which means 44,000 visitors every minute of every day. So, but following this, there have been a bunch of states in the United States that have declared it a public health crisis, and this was as of 2020, so that may be more. I don't know. I didn't have a chance to go look that up. But even in non-Christian areas, this is a website, for example, that has no religious connection whatsoever, but they are they're trying to help people understand the negative effects of the use of pornography. So it's called Fight the New Drug, because they recognize that the use of pornography can have an effect upon the brain in a similar way that drugs can have on the effect of the brain. I mean, drugs are bringing in outside chemicals that overstimulate the brain, whereas pornography, the imagery triggers the release of the natural chemicals within the body in an overload. Dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, oxytocin. Those are natural chemicals that the body utilizes at various moments, but now it gets overstimulated with these chemicals, and the brain then becomes literally rewired to depend upon these greater and greater experiences, and you need that rush more and more and more. Unfortunately, there's a similar thing, not to the same extent, but even just the use of social media has something like that, where this release of these chemicals within the person. And so we see that this forms the physical addiction aspect to pornography as well as social media. There's that physical aspect of that where sometimes it's very difficult for someone to say no to it. It also affects relationships. If in the sense where if someone's looking at made-up images, they're forming this made-up image of what the other person should be, and then the regular human relationships can never live up to this fake fantasy, and so then it can affect the way that we view the other person. It also is very much instead of giving one's heart in relationship to somebody else for their good, it is all about taking for one's pleasure. And so that can rewire the way that the person engages in the real relationships. It can make them more difficult to engage in those relationships, but also just lost my train of thought, sorry. Anyway, a great line that they have on there that I think is don't give your heart to something without a pulse. Right, because that's what ends up happening is one's heart gives being consumed by this non-relationship. And that's oftentimes what any addiction happens is it's a replacement of a good lasting relationships with something else. And of course, pornography is going to affect society, they point out. I mean, with it just continuing to expand, more and more people, of how much lack of energy and time. I mean, if people are spending all that time using pornography, they're not using that time for other life-giving things. So even just from a secular point of view, recognizing that. We can also recognize what addiction and pornography especially falls into this, is that there can be a cycle of shame that forms within in the person, right? So you have an addictive behavior, and after engaging in addictive behavior, you feel guilt and remorse, right? Even if it's to the point where someone realizes, oh, this is not good for me, I don't want it, I don't like it, I hate it, so the guilt and remorse, the vow to change, I'm going to change, I'm not going to do it again. But then there's a stressor, some kind of trigger that in the past has led them to the addictive behavior, and so when that happens again, it leads them to the addictive behavior to try to get away from the stressor. But now they did the addictive behavior, and now it leads them back down to the guilt, and they hit this endless cycle of shame. And it can be very difficult to get out of the trap. I mean, you've got this psychological kind of cycle, as well as the physical cycle, where the brain has been rewired to chemically want to depend upon it. And that's why any kind of addiction, whether it's alcohol or drugs or pornography like this, can be difficult to escape from. Doesn't make it impossible, though. It can be. The good news is, if our brains can be rewired by something like this, they can be rewired back, away from it. But as in any kind of, sin that a person may be struggling with, and that's the one thing too, is like someone who's been maybe caught or trapped in pornography, it doesn't mean that they're a worse person or than anyone. Any of these sins, right? Anybody who's committed any of these sins, whether they're abortion or contraception or any of these, the church doesn't point out and say like, you are a worse sinner than anybody else. No, we are all sinners and who have fallen short of the love of God, and we all need redemption from Jesus, right? And there's no sin that God can't forgive and bring healing and freedom from. So one of the things to note is that, unfortunately, this statistic too may have changed. This was from 2022, so I would guess if it has changed, it has become earlier in the children's age when they are exposed to pornography. But because it's so prevalent with the internet and everything out there. So what should a child do when they see pornography? There's 3 steps, to teach children. There are bad pictures. There are good pictures and bad pictures. That's a bad picture. Turn it off or turn away, and then tell mom or dad. Tell someone that you trust, that loves you, right? And the mom and dads shouldn't be like, oh, how could you ever have looked at that? You're bad, and don't push them into the shame cycle. That's one of the things we want to make sure doesn't happen, because a child can be exposed to this from very young, and from very young, it works on their brain that they get confused as to there's the curiosity aspect where it feels good, but then there's the shame aspect where we know that it's wrong. And so it's confusing if you don't know what to do with it. And so if the response of a parent is shame, or is to shame them, or to that could get them caught in a cycle of addiction for many years to come. And oftentimes that's what I may see. You might find out that people are struggling with that as adults. It really began as a child, and it wasn't something that they ever really were seeking out them specifically, but they got trapped in that. So a good resource for parents. If you want to how do I talk to my kids about this? How do I know how to do this? This is a book that you can to help you. Good pictures, bad pictures, and it kind of goes through the kind of that how do we talk to. And obviously, these kinds of topics that we're talking about with regard to theology of the body, I put some resources, for parents, the theology of the body for kids and things like that. Is that as parents, you want to know, this is part of your responsibility to how do I teach my children about these kinds of things at the appropriate time and in the appropriate way. As a church, we can help you with resources, and so you can always, but we always want to make sure parents are involved in those kinds of topics, because you know your children and the appropriate way for when they're going to need to do that. Fortunately, there's all sorts of different versions of pornography. A lot of it now is just what people send one another. It's not even just companies that are producing it. It's individuals that are sharing it with one another. One of the things to note about this is that from one young woman who found out the hard way, is she says those things don't go away, ever, right? So be careful that it's like anything we put on the internet. If you put it on the internet, assume it's going to be there forever. So, all right. Achieving Freedom, Battle Plan. This comes from Matt Fradd. He is another Catholic apologist that will do some talk about pornography and helping overcome that. So he has some resources. These are some of the steps he puts out. Obviously prayer. We need to ask God for His help. Whatever kind of sins that we struggle with, we need to ask God. Sins, especially addictive type sins. Having not just isolate it within ourselves. Remember we talked about the rules for discernment of spirits. We talked about how the devil wants things to be kept secret. So if we're struggling with a sin, especially something that we're ashamed of, that's what the enemy wants us to do, is just keep it secret. But he has more control over us if we keep it secret. If we are accountable to someone that can help us so that we can overcome it, then we can achieve greater freedom. So accountable, might include things like they have accountability software on devices. If it's my phone that I know that's a near occasion of sin, then we can use accountability software that, it keeps me accountable to somebody else. They know what I'm using my phone for. Sometimes counseling can be needed. Education, perseverance is always going to be important in the entire faith life, but especially in sin that we, consistent sins that we struggle with, because we will get, if we have habitual sins, we get tired of confessing them. We get tired of having to deal with it and wish it would just go away. And we might wonder, well, why, God, don't you just take it away and I don't have to deal with it anymore. But perseverance is needed. God is at work helping us to gain greater freedom from that. And we're not going to be perfect in our fights and battles against it. But important thing is that, this kind of idea is that, another from the discernment of spirits is the enemy will try to, that shame part is to try to make someone feel that they're worthless. You're never going to be able to overcome this. You're the worst person possible. Nobody else struggles with this. When obviously we saw statistically that's not true. But the reality is that God actually does love you. Let's see, do I have?
Listen, no matter what you've done, no matter what's happened to you, no matter what you did this morning, Jesus Christ apparently thinks that you were worth the death of his son. You. I know, I don't get it either. And you don't have to believe that. You're perfectly fine. Continue to live as if you're scum, that God can't possibly enjoy you like you. You can continue to live like that if you will. But in doing that, you're not living in accord with reality. So just give up and just submit to reality. He really, really likes you.
All right. It's important to say, because that's what the enemy tries to convince us of. Purity, though, is not so much a destination as it's a daily choice that we make. And that's the case with the whole Christian life, right? Each day we're striving to follow the Lord. All right. So far we've talked about contraception, abortion, pornography. We've got one more on our list here when he talks about artificial fertilization. So we're going to look at that one next. So in our course here, we've got from contraception to abortion, and then to IVF, in vitro fertilization, as well as surrogacy, are examples of the removal of the union of spouses from procreation. Right? So it's an attempt to use other means outside of the natural joining together of husband and wife in the sexual union to create the new life of children. And while the Catholic Church is, human life is very, very good, it doesn't mean we can use any means at our disposal to produce human life. They have to be done in accordance with the way God has made us. So we'll look at in vitro fertilization. So the context of this is for those suffering with infertility. There's many people that suffer with infertility. This has always been the case. If you look in the Bible, right, we've got all sorts of cases of couples that are infertile, right? A lot of the, Abraham and Sarah and going all the way up into, the New Testament time. We've got Zechariah and Elizabeth. And so that's a kind of constant theme within the Scripture of couples struggling with infertility. And so it continues to happen today. Here's an example from the Scripture. When Rachel saw, this would be one of Jacob's wives. When Rachel saw that she had not borne children to Jacob, she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." Right? So you can hear in that the angst, for her of unable to have children. So yes, this is certainly a suffering. And so for those that propose things that seem to be medical advances, like in vitro fertilization, it's because they desire to alleviate the suffering of the couples that are experiencing that. And so there's nothing wrong with wanting to alleviate that suffering. But that's a good thing, to want to alleviate suffering. But not every method to alleviate suffering is going to be automatically good, right? So this is an important moral principle in the Catholic Church, that in order, we talk about means and ends. So a means is going to be, the method that we're to do something, and the end is going to be, the final goal we're trying to achieve, right? So in order for any action to be moral, both the end and the means to achieve that end have to be moral, right? So for the case of in vitro fertilization, so the end would be we want to alleviate the suffering of infertility. That end is moral. Right? That's a perfectly moral, a good end to try to achieve. But the means through in vitro fertilization is immoral. That is not going to be a moral means, and we'll go into here in a second why it's immoral. So it's praiseworthy to want to try to overcome infertility, but the method that you go about it needs to be morally acceptable according to God's law. So another principle, therefore, is, you might hear sometimes the end justifies the means. This is not a Christian principle. That does not hold true for Christian morality. The end can never justify the means that is used. Just because you have a good end, you're trying to accomplish something good, doesn't mean you can, do awful things to achieve it, right? So, give examples in the case of infertility, or not necessarily infertility, but in attempting to conceive a child, right? So there are scriptural examples of methods or means that are not acceptable. So you go into the Scripture, and you go, for example, to Abraham and Sarah, right? So I mentioned them already. They weren't unable to have a child. And so one of the methods was basically a kind of surrogacy, where Hagar, the slave woman, Abraham was going to have a child with her, right? And but that was not according to God's law, or it wasn't according to His plan. And we do find in there that a lot of strife comes from that, right? It basically, they end up having to send Hagar and Ishmael away because of the strife that it causes within the family, right? So that would be an immoral example of an attempt to bring forth the life of a child. Jacob and Rachel. So we just talked about. Jacob had his first wife, Leah, and then he also had two maidservants. And so in this case, he's now, Jacob is first fooled by his uncle to marry Leah, and then he marries Rachel, and then when they're not able to have as many children, then they're like, all right, my maidservant will then be a surrogate for me. And once again, this leads to conflict within the family that is going to culminate in selling Joseph into slavery. Of course, God's going to be able to bring good out of it anyway. That's one of the important things to point is that, well, actually, I'll bring that up here in a second. Well, we'll look at the third one. The last one is Noah's unmarried daughters after the flood. And you may not know this story as much because it's probably, there's certain things in the scripture that we don't necessarily always draw people's attention to. This would be one of them. This would be where they try to get their father drunk and then have children from him. So, once again, not a legitimate means of trying to conceive a child. So, the circumstances of one's conception can be immoral. The creation of a child doesn't automatically make an immoral action moral. Just because a child is now resulted doesn't make it moral. So this is very, if someone has questions about IVF, it's very clear with something like rape, right? If someone conceives a child through rape, the rape was not made moral because of there's a child there now, right? It doesn't suddenly become moral. Same way with IVF. Just because someone is able to conceive a child through IVF does not now suddenly make IVF automatically moral. But the opposite is also true, where once a child is now in existence, whether it's from IVF or rape or whatever other things, just because a child was conceived through immoral means does not make the child any less valuable. They're just as valuable. So sometimes people will, how can the church say that? How can the church say, the means of one's conception was immoral? Doesn't that take away the dignity of that child? No, not at all. I mean, any child that's conceived through immoral means still remains a child of infinite worth in the eyes of God. So that's important to note. But it can't change the fact that immoral means were used to bring it about. So let's look at the aspects of in vitro fertilization, and we'll find that a bunch of steps along the way, immoral things are happening. And this is why the church is going to reject it. So what's required in order to do this? In vitro fertilization is going to be the obtaining of the gametes, both male and female, from the woman and the man. And the means for obtaining them are immoral means. So the egg harvesting of women is an immoral thing to do. It's also very dangerous, potentially health-wise, for women. There's a good expose kind of on that. It's put together in 2010 called Egg Exploitation. That kind of goes through and looks at that industry, the fertility industry, and the kinds of things that happen in it, and why it is the kinds of things that are done that are not going to be good. With regard to obtaining the male gametes, the means of obtaining the sperm are also immoral. So the church teaches the deliberate stimulation of sexual organs outside of the loving act between husband and wife, giving themselves to each other in the marital embrace. To do it outside of that is gravely immoral. Another thing that egg and sperm donation often can do is also separate the child from their parents. Right? We would see that as the purposeful separation of a child from his parents. We would see that as not a good. I mean, in some cases, if we're purposely doing that, it could be immoral. In other cases, it's a tragedy. Right? Say parents die, and so the child is separated from their parents. We see that as being tragic, right? But in the case of the fertility industry, that's what's happening: is you're separating the child from the parent, where their biological parent. Let's see. So once again, there's another expose kind of on that. Anonymous Father's Day. Some of the things you hear, some of the people, because they'll be like, I'm glad I exist, but I can still question the circumstances of my conception, as to whether this was good, because it's like, I know my, I'd like to know my dad. He was number 21, and that's all I know. And they point out too is like, I have the medical history of my parents is now withheld from me. Like, I know nothing about my medical history in my family because I don't know who my family is, right? And so that these kinds of things, and listening to adults now that are now from that, is like we're kind of playing God here in the way that we're doing things, and to begin to question, is this a good thing? The church is going to say that these are not moral things for us to pursue. So it's not so much that it's simply use of technology. The Catholic Church is not against the use of technology, right? There's plenty of wonderful, good technology, science and technology. Science developed, we talked about that one at the time, science developed from within this worldview that God is not the same as nature, and so you can study nature. So science and technology can be very good. But here's the difference with regard to this area, is it's how the technology is used. So if this medical intervention helps or assists the marriage act to achieve pregnancy, that is, for the most part, going to be moral. So you're assisting the act. So we talked about last time, like the use of various techniques in natural family planning, or NAPRO technology from the Pope Paul VI Institute, right, to try to help understand so that they can achieve a pregnancy, right? Those are going to be moral because they help or assist the marital act. But what's going to be immoral is the intervention replacing the marriage act in order to bring about life, right? So if the act of self-gift to each other of spouses is replaced by some other thing, which is what IVF does, you're doing something in a laboratory, now outside of the womb of the mother and apart from that act of intercourse, then that's going to be immoral. So that's where to start with evaluating, because inevitably there's going to be new technologies that are always going to come up. And we can wonder, okay, what does the church say about this yet? Well, here's some starting principles to begin to evaluate it. So remember that the marriage act itself is sacred, the way that we've talked about it before. There's two ends, right? We've talked about the unitive end and the procreative end, and you can't separate the two from each other. If you break those two apart, then that's where you're going to be in immoral grounds when you do that, and that's what IVF does, is it separates the two. So contraception separates them so that you're doing union without the openness, and IVF brings about the life without the union. So following what Dr. Lejeune was saying, he was saying that basically the same thing. So to separate those two parts is immoral, gravely immoral. Another reason why this is an immoral process. But other details about IVF process. What often has to be done is that in order for the process to have a higher likelihood of it being able to be successful, multiple embryos are going to be created. And the moment the embryo is created there, now you have a human being, right? That is ensouled with a human soul by God at the very moment of its conception. But now you have multiple little human beings, the embryos, but you maybe only wanted one. And so some of them may be implanted into the womb, while others discarded, used for other things, kept in storage. That is not a moral way to use human life. So what ends up happening in this process is that one is desiring to create human life. One wants a child, but in order to do that, you destroy other human life to make it happen, right? And that is an immoral thing for us to do. We may not do that. Another part of this whole process is something called selective reduction. To increase the odds of that working, oftentimes, as I said, multiple embryos are produced first, but then also multiple embryos may be attempted at being implanted. And so if more than one are implanted and they end up surviving, well, first, if they're attempted to implant and then they fail to implant, then that embryo is expelled basically as an abortion, right? But if they both, let's say, you wanted one child, but now you have two that have successfully implanted, the doctors that are doing this are going to suggest that this be selectively reduced. Let's choose the more likely of them that will survive and reduce the other one, aka abort the other one. Right? Once again, this is just another version of a kind of abortion. So once again, the church is going to be, this is going to be an immoral thing to do. The next one. All right. There's the question about what happens to the unused embryos, kind of alluded to already. They're left oftentimes frozen in storage to be used later, sometimes by the same couple, sometimes donated out to other couples, sometimes it may be for research purposes. Here's what the church says in the document Donum Vitae. These unborn human persons are exposed to an absurd fate, with no possibility of their being offered safe means of survival which can be licitly pursued. The problem is what happens here is that you now have a situation, the immoral action after immoral action that led to the production of this human life that's now in this state, you're now stuck in a spot where the only step forward will necessitate you committing more immoral actions against them. Like and this is a really difficult thing because I've had couples come to me that have gone through this, and now they're like, we didn't realize this is what was going to happen, but now we're told we have these children that are now frozen, and what do we do about it? And it becomes a real pain for them because now they've gone through a conversion process and now they realize what they never should have done that. Of course, oftentimes they're conflicted because they may have their own child that was produced, through that, and it's a child they love and they should and that is wonderfully and beautifully in God's image, but we still can question the means by which the child was produced without questioning the worth or value. So the question is, well, what can we morally do? And the difficult thing is that it's very difficult to see if there is a moral means to pursue. So in my mind, it really points out, and why, like when I'm doing marriage prep with couples, we talk about these things, because I want to save them from having to go through that pain. As difficult as infertility may be, this is at least that doesn't have the pain of, I've done something immoral, whereas this carries this moral weight that I've done something to my own child. Related. So once again, that is also going to be very problematic morally. Surrogacy is oftentimes related to this in the fertility industry, where another woman, the surrogate mother, agrees to bear the child for the other person or persons who will become the child's parents after the birth. This is also an immoral action to do. It's separating that action of love between spouses and the raising the child. It's also using that woman. That woman oftentimes, when they to be surrogates, sometimes they do it altruistically. They want to do a good to help others. But the industry is using them as a means to an end. They're using them as an object, right? You are not a mother. You're just a container for this child that's then going to be passed on to somebody else. And what this whole fertility industry does is it ultimately treats children like products, right? We want children on our terms, the way that we want them, with the characteristics that we think they should have, So the mentality that's built into this is it turns children into objects. It turns the women into objects with surrogacy and the children as well. Some of these things, obviously my clips are not coming up. There's clips of witnesses of those who've gone through it and discovered it's not all the good that they thought it was going to be. Let's see. All right, because what ends up happening here is that you have suffering that's replaced with suffering, as I mentioned. So internal suffering of the parents unable to have a child. Now you have the suffering of what they realize of what they've done. and gone through, and the pain from that. Having talked to couples, it's not an easy thing. So that's why I always encourage, don't fall down that path in the first place. So other moral options instead. So obviously adoption is certainly a moral thing. The church allows. It can be a very good thing. Obviously we want in adoption, every child should have a mother and a father. Ideally you would have the biological parents that are fit to be able to raise their child. But if it's a case in which adoption is going to be is what is needed, then that is a very good thing. Foster care, also very good. We talked about all the things the Pope Paul VI Institute can do with various medical assistance. That's honoring the way God has created us. Obviously, it can't solve every problem, and it may be the case in which God may be calling a couple to give of themselves in other ways, right? When they find themselves unable to have their own biological children. I want to point out that those who suffer from infertility, and we talk about your love has to be free, total, faithful, fruitful, and you're like, well, I don't have any children, so therefore I'm not fruitful in my marriage. Well, no, that's not. You have to be open to the possibility of life, but it doesn't necessarily automatically mean you will end up having children. But if you have that openness, and you find you're unable to have children, you want to how God are you asking us to be open in other ways? Maybe you're calling us to serve you in other means. Some of those, for some people, maybe adoption and foster care. For other people, maybe serving in other ways. So, all right. Well, we've reached the end of our time already. Any other questions? Let's see. Next time, let me look ahead as to what we were talking about next time. Next time we'll talk about same-sex relations, and we'll also talk about gender ideology as well next time. So, all right.
I just wanted to share that tomorrow is a solemn feast day of a very important guy in the life of Christ, and I'm very fond of him, so if you're fasting during that, you can actually take tomorrow off.
Yep.
Okay.